a research program supported by the African Academy for Migration and Research. So I'll take you through the program agenda, then we'll go directly to Dr. Tufena to give us an opening remark. So next slide, please. So this is the program agenda. We'll be having opening remarks from Dr. Tufena soon. Then we'll have 5 presentations. A presentation on facing the COVID-19 pandemic in displacement by Dr. Alfred. Then a presentation on refugee strategies to cope with the coronavirus pandemic by Dr. Sisit. And a presentation on regular cash transfers and the impact of COVID-19 by Dr. Brenda. A presentation on COVID-19 induced urban rural migration and environmental degradation in Uganda by Dr. Jerome, and a presentation on education amidst conflict and forced displacement. Whose agenda is it? Then we'll open the session for discussion. This is a webinar, so you'll be allowed to talk when the time comes. Then later on, after that, we'll have a closing remark by Dr. Tufena. Next, yes. Some housekeeping items. Please mute your microphones when you are not speaking. When you want to talk, just click the microphone icon, then you can talk. If you have any questions, comments, please write it in the Q&A box. And then later on, during the discussion time, we'll respond to the questions. And this webinar is now being recorded, and we'll be making it available through the Austria's YouTube channel and of course, the website. So it's just to let you know. Next. So thank you so much. I will now give the floor to Dr. Tufena to give us a short opening remark before we go to the presentations. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. I want to thank all of you for making time to attend to this webinar and also be presenters to share your knowledge on what you know about the impacts of COVID-19 on migration and migrants, refugees and IDPs. I take this opportunity also to thank the African Academy for Migration and Research, who are our partners and donors on this, and they have been funded by GCRF and ARUA. Thank you very much for their generous contribution of promoting scholarship in Africa. At this time, I will not go deep into talking about this project, because if I do that, then I will be preempting the beautiful presentations that we want to listen to this afternoon. I just want to welcome all of you and declare this session open.
Thank you. Excellent. Okay, thanks so much. Now I'll take you directly to the first presenter. Will be Dr. Alfred. He'll be presenting on facing the COVID-19 pandemic in displacement. Over to you, Dr. Alfred. Thank you.
Hey, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
Yes, I'm presenting on facing the COVID-19 pandemic in displacement, the experience of Batuku pastors at the Uganda-DRC border. The Uganda Democratic Republic of Congo border area. And I'm talking about the Batuku pastors. These are people who have lived at this border even before the Congo-Uganda border were demarcated. And they had constructed what I'm calling a cultural context that had helped them maneuver the environmental challenges of drought, flooding that happen in that area where they stay. When it is a drought in Uganda, they move to Congo, and when it is a drought to the other side, they return to Uganda, and sometimes even the area floods, and so when it floods, they cross to the other side of the border. And from there, I say that these Batuku pastorists, like many other border people, have not just been passive in this border area. They have constructed that, what I have called a cultural border context, that had helped them. Doesn't emphasize citizenship. And I'm citing from Tulate in 2006. They produce their own context that is rooted in their special practices that transcend the national state boundaries. And it is this that border cultural context of the Batuku that has been their resilience. It has helped them to have connections or networks with other people who are not Batuku, either pastorists themselves or non-pastorists across the border. But it has also helped them to create trips or routes where they pass and outwit national state surveillance mechanisms. And in that, it has been a source of resilience in times of need. But it has been challenged by the insecurity in DRC, because when insecurity came, when they cross, their animals are taken by the militias in DRC. And for that reason, many pastorists have lost their livelihood. They have lost their livestock, and the government of Uganda put them in concentration camps for easy provision of basic needs. And that is what I refer to as displacement. They have been displaced and put in IDP camps for easy provision of basic needs. So with the coming of COVID-19 pandemic, not only did the border become a hard border, a border normally had been porous. The border had naturally been porous, and you would agree with me that African nations have always been weak at the border. People cross or they outwit the border, the state mechanisms that protect the border. But with the coming of COVID, the border became hard, a hard border, because there are more restrictions for crossing or either from Uganda or from Congo. And so people who used to sneak out to DRC either to work, or those who had lost their livestock, could not sneak out anymore. And so this made them suffer a lot, and that's why I'm saying they have been facing the COVID-19 in displacement. I'm using a border theory perspective, which also says that borders are not a product of geography. It highlights the reality that whether borders are arbitrary or intra-ethnic or politically divisive, they are often accepted and reproduced grounds of social and economic life of borderland people. And borders hold meanings to people who live as feed them. And such meanings are contested by other social groups or social formations. What Migdo calls mental maps. They incorporate elements of meaning people attach, spatial configurations like border, the royalties they hold, the emotions they hold, the passions that groups evoke when a border is talked about or when they cross the border. There are cognitive ideas about how, these holdings of emotions, of passions, of royalties, they are cognitive ideas that such people like Batuku hold about the their world, the surroundings they live in. This year also maintains that there is a cultural context that connects people and their practices at the border, and in so doing, they also mark the separation between groupings. And the border people also are not, as I said earlier, are not spectators. They are dynamic. They typically constitute their own cross-border society that does not emphasize citizenship. Border subjects produce their own context, which I'm talking about, rooted in their social practice that transcends the national boundary. African borders, as I said earlier, have a particular salience that is of a mixed inefficiency and also inconsistent enforcement. The provision of services at most African borders is inefficient, is not effective enough, and also the enforcement has also been inconsistent. But with the coming of COVID, this particular salience of the African border has been affected. The borders became effective. The enforcement became consistent. There were complete stoppage of crossing and crisscrossing. So these sweeping changes to people's lives, social interactions, and the government functioning and global relations that COVID-19 pandemic has caused, we need to understand it from experiences of people that dwell there. I mean the experiences of border dwellers. So I look at border insecurity, abductions, confinement, and the COVID-19 pandemic restrictions. And I say that the drought at the Uganda-DRC border had deprived the Watuku of their livestock. Insecurity in DRC had restricted the Watuku's migrations across the border due to militia abducting any pastoralists that crossed and taking their animals. The government of Uganda had to put those pastoralists whose livestock were depleted by the drought into protection camps for easy provision of basic needs. COVID-19 pandemic came at this point in time, and more restrictions were slapped on the movements, hence confining them in camps. Loss of livestock among the Watuku means loss of self-esteem, because livestock among the Watuku is the source of, is the lens through which a person is seen as a person, as a man who has power, as a man who can marry, as a man who has money, as a man who has providence. So losing it meant losing self-esteem. It also means loss of ritual direction and purpose. It again also means social relations become senseless, because social relations of the Watuku are constructed on cattle and cattle exchanges. Marriages are done on exchange of cattle. Friendships are done on exchange of cattle. So without cattle, social relations become senseless. Social positioning of individuals among the Watuku society is also anchored in cattle and cattle ownership. So the personhood is misguided when livestock are depleted, because the meanings of a person among the Watuku relates to the possession of cattle. So these confined Watuku pastoralists have lost their personhood. I conclude this discussion or this presentation by saying that the resilience the Watuku had enjoyed through their border cultural context has weakened due to militia activities of abductions, insecurity, and restrictions that came with the coming of the COVID-19 pandemic. I recommend that states must come to the table, the regional states come to the table and maintain peace in the Great Lakes region. I mean, eradication of militias in this region must be done by all the states in the Great Lakes region. And that's when these people will regain their positions as people on the border. Then regional states also must create corridors where public goods and services must be accessed by border people irrespective of citizenship. The public goods and services, I mean, services like education, schools must be accessed by people who cross the border irrespective of citizenship. Hospitals, people must access health care services across the border, even if they are not of the same, I mean, citizens of any state. Services for animal vaccination must be also accessed in areas where people are, irrespective of citizenship. And then policies also should be designed with the cultural frameworks of the people who are targeted. I mean, if states are designing or policymakers are designing policies, they should have too much consultations with the people who are targeted by policies. I thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Dr. Alfred, for your presentation on the impact of COVID-19 on borderland communities. The case of the Batuku cross-border pastoralists at the Uganda-DRC border. Thank you so much for that. If participants, if you have questions, please put it in the chat area, the Q&A area. And also during our discussion, we'll open the session for question and answers. Thank you, Dr. Alfred. I will go direct to the next presentation. That will be by Dr. Sisit, and it will be on refugee strategies to cope with the coronavirus pandemic. Over to you, Dr. Sisit.
Okay, so can I continue?
Yes, please continue.
Okay, thank you for giving me this chance. So I will try to keep the presentation short because I thought we had like 10 minutes. So I'm going to speak about refugee strategies to cope with the coronavirus pandemic in the case of Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. So I'm going to speak about the coping strategies and the challenges of urban refugees. So just to say something about urban refugees in Ethiopia, as you know, totally Ethiopia hosted about 1 million refugees until recently, in which most of the refugees are living in 26 different camps which are found in different...
Sorry, Drosit, can you speak louder?
Are you hearing?
Yes, we can hear. Can you speak louder?
Even louder than this one?
Okay. Yes, that's okay now.
Okay. So,
Thank you.
So as you know, Ethiopia is one of the largest refugee destinations in Africa, next to Uganda. So most of the refugees in Ethiopia are living in refugee camps, which are found in different parts of the country. But we have also urban refugees who are living in the capital city as well as in other metropolitans such as Mekelle and Dredwa. So Addis Ababa is the home to an estimated number of 31,000 refugees, in which only 20,000 of refugees are registered, and we anticipate there are many of urban refugees are unregistered. Particularly unregistered refugees are from Eritrea and Somalia, but these unregistered refugees have no access to health care, education, and other legal services. Besides, the number of unregistered refugees, especially from Eritrea, is estimated to be more than 3 times the total number of urban registered refugees, because as you know, Eritrean people have many similarities with Ethiopian people. So, you know, there is no, they can easily come to Ethiopia and integrate and live with the community easily. These they suffer from the economic and social predicaments of the pandemic because of lack of systematic response mechanisms for unregistered refugees. So the difficulty they faced become complicated because even before the coronavirus pandemic, many refugees in Addis Ababa lived and worked in precarious conditions, as you can imagine, and were often unable to make a living. And the livelihood of many refugees has been completely lost due to the new approach of controlling the spread of pandemic of coronavirus, especially the restrictions and the state emergency issues, which crushed the informal economic activities into which many unserved refugees were enrolled. So when we see the rationale of the study focused on the refugees in Addis Ababa, the capital city of Ethiopia, who come from Eritrea, Sudan, South Sudan, and Great Lakes region. So the study also points out the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on urban refugees and their strategies to sustain their livelihoods during the pandemic era. So in terms of methodology, the approach that were used for this research was qualitative approach. And about when I say qualitative approach, as you can imagine, even the data were collected during the restrictive time. So all of the interviews were conducted virtually using WhatsApp and other forms of social network. And the data were collected from 20 participants between May and August 2020. Because as you remember, March 15 was a day that the first coronavirus victim was explored in Ethiopia. So these data were collected during May and August. So since this was a peak time for the pandemic, so all of the interviews were conducted virtually. So the interviews were from Eritrea, Democratic Republic of Congo, and from South Sudan. And these all refugees were living in urban area of Addis Ababa. So in terms of age, the participants were between the age of 20 to 50. So as a matter of time, I will just rush to the main findings of the study. So, Mikias, can you confirm me that still you are hearing?
Yes, ma'am.
So, the first thing that the result of this research is wants to touch is on the impact on local economies and livelihood securities of the refugees. As you can imagine, especially the urban refugees in Addis Ababa they are not allowed to participate in the formal work sector because, as you remember, Ethiopia only allowed refugees to engage in different work sectors only in 2018, but immediately after the ratification of the new refugee policy, we had this corona pandemic. So unfortunately, there were no systematic way of accommodating refugees into the formal sector, even though it has been already ratified. So the informal economy were the major economic sectors that accommodate refugees from different parts of Africa. So the informal economy was majorly affected by the shutdown of the pandemic as well. So more than 77% of economic activity in Addis Ababa is informal business. This is obvious for even for the Ethiopian citizens. So the government sector obviously compensated the workers. That means people during this state emergency and other restrictions were compensated by the government. That means they were staying at home, but they were receiving their salary, and there were different mechanisms to accommodate the Ethiopian citizens during the pandemic era. So PT trade, waitressing, and barber shops were the major sectors that refugees were engaged before the pandemic. Unfortunately, most of these sectors has been smashed by the impact of the coronavirus. Actually, not by the disease, but the consecutive measures that have been taken by Ethiopian government, including the shutdown of some sectors, and also because of the restriction of the movement. Because, as I have said, especially refugees from Eritrea were highly engaged in waitressing, and they were highly engaged in barbershop and beauty salons, and they were also engaged in wedding planning. These were some sectors that refugees have been engaged before the pandemic. So the pandemic totally smashed such informal sectors. So they were, totally, they lost their livelihood in as urban refugees, especially as out of camp refugees. So the first lose was lose of informal work as income base. So as I've said, refugees who are working as hairdresser in a beauty salon, refugees who have been, doing in different petty trades have been, totally fell apart from engaging in such kind of activities. And the second was loss of remittance as income base. As you can imagine, especially for refugees who are living in urban centers in Addis Ababa, they are living in urban centers as OCP or out of camp refugees. This is the kind of policy that Ethiopia have only for Eritrean refugees because they were supposed to have relatives in Addis Ababa and they can compensate. They were compensating their life by remittance. But remittances was one of the principal source of income for urban refugees. So according to informantes, their principal source of income, which was remittance, has been lost because of the COVID crisis in the West. That means from America and from uh, European countries. So, almost the people who were living by receiving money from their relatives abroad were highly affected during this pandemic. The third was, the precarious housing condition. So when we see the housing condition of the people, especially for refugees, uh, most of Eritrean and Somalian refugees were living in a mass by renting small houses, condominiums, and others also prefer to live in, slum areas because it was supposed like in slum areas, the cost of the housing is relatively low. And in these areas, many refugees, especially group of young refugees, were used to live in group. That's what happened during the COVID crisis time. Refugees' houses are often small huts, of course, and they were not able to sustain their living because there is no remittance. They were not able to participate in the informal working activities, and the owners of the house also try to impose the refugees to decrease a number of families and relatives. So this was another hard uh, challenge that urban refugees have faced during the COVID virus. And the third one is, reduced food base. As it is now, there is no ration which is distributed by the UNHCR or any other humanitarian organization, including the RRS or Refugees Return Service. So, in this regard, Eritrean refugees are grateful for their Ethiopian neighbors who used to share what they have with them. So, especially following the sharing food campaign, many volunteer people were mobilizing food items and distributing to the community, which was, which includes Eritrean and other refugees as well. So the second part is about coping strategies, how the refugees try to, escape from such kind of challenges during the COVID virus. So the first one was looking for aid. Of course, as I have said, they were looking for aid from different sectors, including from the Ethiopian government. Of course, some of the responses of the government was good since the demand of aid was high during the COVID time. Still, it has some problems, but the first strategies that the refugees try to cope was, looking for aid from those governmental and non-governmental organizations. And the second one was sharing living space. As I have said, many refugees were displaced from their rented house because of they were not agreeing with their landlords and landladies because of a number of refugees. Because one of the characteristics of urban refugees is, they try to live, they try to share a small space for many refugees, which created a dispute between refugees and their the owner of the house. So sharing the living space and moving by to the places where relatively peaceful landlords are living was one of the strategies. That means in this regard, many people were living these individual houses and they were trying to join their relatives who were living in condominium and other apartments, because in apartments and condominium the control of the owner of the house is less visible. So they had a relatively relaxed way of living other than living in the individual rented houses. And the other coping strategy was change in the dietary behaviors. Obviously, it's anticipated that in previous time they might have extended food time. For example, if they were eating 4 times a day, and during COVID time, some of the informants were telling me like they reduced their food meal time up to 2, and there were times they substitute eating food like meat, fruits, and other luxurious, the so-called quote-unquote luxurious food to some products like bread, injera, and relatively less expensive products. This was one of the coping strategy, and the other one was by the informant was religion as hope and support. One of the major coping strategies as they were using was people were, especially refugees, were trying to perform religious activities, and they were trying to attend spiritual activities from the first and the most online. So these were some of the coping strategies that refugees were using during the COVID pandemic. And as a conclusion, the COVID-19 pandemic highlighted the weakness of support system for refugees, especially for urban refugees, while underscoring the importance of ongoing work to address social inequalities among refugees was already poor, and refugees.
Try now, try. Okay.
Okay.
Continue.
I'm left with a paragraph. So finally, refugees must be part of the strategies and measures developed by government against the pandemic. This is what I've drawn from the conclusion part of this research. So I'm done with my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Susit. For that elaborate presentation, you have touched on several things. The impact of COVID-19 on urban refugees, basically in Addis Ababa, and you have touched the impact they face due to COVID-19 and the various coping mechanisms they have utilized to sustain their livelihood during the COVID-19. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, please write it in the chat area, or later you can raise it during the discussion time. Thank you so much. The next presenter is Dr. Jerome. He will be presenting on COVID-19, induced urban-rural migration and environmental degradation in Uganda. So Dr. Jerome, the floor is yours.
Thank you. My computer refused to fix the PowerPoint. I don't know that they can help me fix it for me. Is there a way it can?
Can you send the PowerPoint to him? Yes, you have already sent it. Huh? It's there. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, this paper is called COVID-19 induced urban-rural migration and the environmental degradation in Uganda, and the ripple effects of the socio-economic impact of Corona and the youth question. So this paper is written by me and Dr. Trofena, but it's also slide 2. It's also, this paper is part of the findings of the study that was conducted in Uganda under the Ugandan chapter of IGAD, regional project focusing on COVID-19. And it is funded by, if you go second slide down, it is funded by the implementing partners there, Makerere, Oslia, CCR, DR, RDCRC in Canada. So it is part of the work. Just for you to know, when we were doing the impact of COVID-19, we did not anticipate environment as a key issue while we had covered it, but it wasn't the main target of what we discovered later during the field work. So in December 2019, COVID-19 began to spread in China. March 21st, we had the first case in Uganda. On 31st March 2020, the extreme measures were set in place to prevent the spread of Ebola. And this included a national lockdown with the entire country. By July 2020, the cases had begun to rise, and we registered our first death in the country. However, a lot of effort was done by government to reinforce the projected effects of the pandemic. Budgets were supplemented, and additional money was given to different sectors like the health, the media, the education, the agriculture, security, state house, and local government. Now, that effort really resulted positive results. Uganda's effort resulted in flattening the curve of transmission. If there was a witch doctor trying to bewitch Uganda, it failed. We managed to prevent death at that point, and also to flatten the curve, especially in the early stage of corona. However, the drastic measures taken to curb COVID-19 created great strains on the livelihoods, especially of the urban youth in Uganda. The lockdown specifically disrupted and severely affected the youth economic situation in the country. Access to social services like health, food security, education, trade, peace, security, social protection, water and sanitation, all these sectors were disrupted. It is true, it was envisioned in the long-term effect of the crisis that would include levels of many youth becoming unemployed and the aggregation of their vulnerability. That was projected to happen. So government ratified certain policies to mitigate COVID-19 and to help citizens build resilience for better post-COVID. They started coming up with the programs of having food, giving some checks, money, creating some resources for people to earn. But little was thought about the impact of the pandemic on the induced internal migration and environment. All this was planned looking at the impact that would happen, but little did anybody think of that people are likely to move across the districts. In fact, the president ensured that people don't move because movement was restricted, but still people moved. And we see that as people moved from urban centers to rural areas, a lot of impact was on environment and the communities that benefit in this environment. Much of the impact of the pandemic were anticipated and widely reported. A number of studies in Uganda have discussed the impact of COVID-19 on communities, especially on security, maternal health, and well-being. However, the ripple effects of the reported impacts were not clearly systematized and disintegrated. This paper reveals how the youth from the city and urban centers affected the rural communities when they migrated from the cities to survive the pandemic. The paper specifically looks at COVID-19 and its impact on the environment. So, Uganda's response to COVID-19, was a commendable effort, especially from the health perspective. In containing the epidemic, when it flattened the curve, we scored high. However, policymakers now have to face the reality of the difficulty of balancing the positive health impact of flattening the curve with the negative health impact linked with the flattened curve economic activities. As the lockdown got extended, household level economic impact became worse in urban centers. As the lockdown got extended, this led to induced urban-rural migration of urban poor youth to rural areas seeking for food from their ancestral homes. What was never anticipated is what will the urban youth do in the villages, and how could this translate into impacting livelihood, land pressure, and environmental degradation in the rural communities. How did the policies of the government put down to combat COVID-19 became drivers which forced youth to go to the rural areas? What was the impact of the youth when upon their arrival in the rural areas? How were the resources and environment affected by the arrival of the youth in the rural area? We talk about youth because in Uganda, over 80% of the population is 30 years and below. And many of these people the young people live in the urban centers. Now, the theoretical framework for this paper is located in two distinctive lenses. One, the political economy. Some of the political economists like Wills Wicklin and Firehead and Paul Palmer, they talk about the impact of a disease is not just to look at the disease per se on an individual basis, but as a manifestation of key aspects of political economies in a community. So we look at COVID-19 not only as a disease that can be prevented on an individual level, but we look at the wider spectrum of different institutions within the Ugandan economy, political economy, that could not sustain or could not absorb, cover the impact of COVID-19. Understanding the impact of COVID-19 should consider this. We need to consider the structures and institutions that contribute to the inequalities and lack of access to resources and human suffering in the local context. To examine the patterns of COVID-19 closely, we need to ask about the political economy of the pandemic, in which refers to the distribution of effects of COVID-19 between the urban rural youth, between the urban and rural youth, and the behaviors of the youth, and the power relations that affect those factors. It is true that while there was COVID-19 in the city, not all people were affected the same way. Some people were living in the ghetto, locked down where there is no water, shared the toilets. Water is scarce, food is scarce, whereas others were in nice apartments. They would watch TV and play in their compounds. So these inequalities which already were in the society, we need to look at them critically and see what that translated in an Ebola situation. The other theory that we adopted is the critical event by Van Das. Van Das talks about a critical event that changes society. Das argues that the terrain on which a critical event takes, it crisscrosses several institutions, moving from across families, communities, the state, and multinational. And we adopted this to look at COVID-19 as a critical event that devastated the lives of the youth and destroyed and distracted the communities. Yet the youth picked themselves up, tried to live again, and migrated to their ancestral communities. But still, what does that mean to the environment? What does that mean to the communities that live in this environment? Next slide. The methodology we adopted, the study was conducted in Kampala, Masaka, and Gulu. This was done following a mixed methodology approach using both qualitative and quantitative paradigm, but also adopting a phenomenological approach. Researchers focused on the lived experiences of the youth in their communities during the outbreak and tried to conduct a survey and in-depth study of the pandemic among the youth in Uganda. It was also done following a cross-sectional survey design, where the survey was based on questionnaires, focus group discussion, and the key informants. And a sample of 890 youth were randomly selected and reached, and informants were described to explain their lived experiences. And these descriptions were analyzed and arrived to experience relevant to the phenomenon of the pandemic. So the use of this phenomenological approach allowed us to go back in the event of the pandemic and when it started, and to discover what lay bare, hidden, that the survivors' experience went through, especially the young people, and also to critically make an interpretive approach towards the lives they were facing. Next. What were our findings? The impact of COVID-19 in the urban centers became the push factors for urban-rural migration. I think society is used to rural and urban migration. For the first time, Uganda was faced with the challenge that now there is urban-rural migration. As the lockdown disrupted severely and affected the economic situation in the country, we must understand that in Uganda, 85% of the population, mainly youth, are employed in the informal sector, and they are operating below the poverty level. So the youth in urban centers, who mainly live in slums, are characterized with extreme poverty and lack of quality services and infrastructure. These youth are mainly employed in as casual laborers, hawkers, border riders, tailors, hairdressers, market stores, food vendors. However, because of the lockdown, many of the youth have lost their source of regular income. It created a financial instability, and since many had little or no saving to resort to, therefore, COVID-19 did not only cause a public health emergency in Uganda, but now it had turned into an unprecedented suffering on the urban youth. So the push factor, as we started to carry out the research in the urban center, there was a recurring statement from people running to food. Women were telling us, my husband went away. They went back in the villages. We found homes abandoned, women abandoned by men running to the villages. Others decided to take their families to the villages. And this was something coming up, wondering what was pushing people away from the city. We discovered that as what was pushing away people from the city, the main cause of push was food. Food, of course, these other issues, security, whatever, but number one issue was food. Many people could not afford to have food. Now, there's a paradox on that. Next slide. When we ask about the access, if food was available during the lockdown in the urban center, majority of the people, 51% of the respondents, agreed that there was food in the urban center and plenty of food, if to mention. However, while there was plenty of food in the urban center, that a kilo of Irish potato went below as 2,000, that a tray of eggs went below as 5,000. Still, some people could not access food. Why? Because they lacked money and they could not afford to walk to the market areas to buy the food. Others, they were not allowed to move. And for those who live in urban areas, especially those who didn't have money, those who had money, they have plenty of food. But those who didn't have money, they only had to come up with a way of earning. And this was to survive, was to go to the villages. I have a lot of stories here. Some people would say, I had some savings, and the advantage that our village is very close, so I used to go to the village to pick food. Other people say that foodstuffs were plenty, but we didn't have money to buy the foodstuffs. Others will say that the government provided food. Please, next slide. I'm on the next slide. Others would talk about, sorry, I think I've skipped a slide. Okay. The main safety net against these people's food insecurity were one, urban to rural. People had to go to the rural area. The other part was government was providing food, and the other part was NGOs or faith-based organization or well-wishers supported people. However, as we went around doing research, we discovered that most of the food from government did not reach the targeted people. So the food aid from government failed to reach the people whom it was intended. And the distribution was caught up into criminalization, corruption. There was also politics. So many people, while there was government aid supporting the people, food did not reach the people. So people resorted going to the villages. And now I was talking about, as people went to the villages, they were running away from the city because they had no food as a main issue. And having no food created another issue. Next slide. Youth resilience amidst the crisis. The young people began to switch roles. They also had to switch locations. Then they had to switch livelihood. One thing that was clear about COVID-19, it greatly affected the youth in a bigger proportion. And yes, the youth also were determined to live by all means. So living required switching roles. Switching roles meant if your wife had a small little selling vegetables on the street, and maybe you are a boda rider or you work in an office, it meant now you rely on your wife's capacity to sell the little vegetables on the road. So you become the wife or the one taking care of the domestic work, and the wife now start bringing the food. Or you switch location. Some men had to leave, just to leave their home and disappear. Others, they had to send their families back home. Or you had to switch livelihood. If you are a teacher and the schools are closed, then you have to find another work that was allowed to take place. So the crisis had presented non-mental challenges, yet some youth rose to the reality of the challenges and loaded with opportunity. While young people are usually described as reckless, unemployable, poor, with poor attitude, this time, young people were not waiting for the future to lead. They rose to the occasion and they took over ways of earning. How do we survive? It was now survival, not even earning, but survival. Next slide. So in that slide, we see that 43% of the young people now had to come up with engaging in additional income generating activity, a kind of new income generating activity. Others had to borrow money, but the key part that I want to capture in this part of the slide, that they had to come up with a way of earning or surviving, which was new. Next slide. And this newness is what I call the switch of roles, location, and livelihood that I explained before. So at the start of the pandemic, in 2019, we know that 72% of the young people that were interviewed had some kind of economic activity in which they earned income. However, during the lockdown, over 1,406 of these activities stopped due to government's closure. And the closure led to many people being laid off. Others were not able to reach their workplace. Others were in restricted areas. And overall, 91% of the residents in the urban areas confirmed that their household income were negatively impacted. What this led, therefore, is anxiety, family strife, and social ills. The lockdown was causing this on the family. There was anxiety and stress, particularly because of lack of food, lack of family essentials, boredom. People were quarreling at home. Some people never wanted to see each other from morning to evening. And these problems became vicious, continuous. So what happened? In turn, the anxiety, the stress led to depression. Other people went into gambling, drug abuse, prostitution. Stories were told where a woman had to sleep with a neighbor, the landlord, so that they can allow them to stay in rent for a month. Stories were told a woman had to sleep with the the people who come to fix electricity, so that they allow them to have electricity. Stories came, a woman had to sleep with a neighbor to get food. Now, apparently, sleeping was one problem, but some people became pregnant in the process of sleeping with a neighbor to get food. And this led into serious issues. It it led issues of people running away or trying to avoid being in that place. Please skip that slide. Let's go to the next slide. Where, yes, double. Here, the separation of families now were in 3 ways. Usually, the head of the household sent the wife and the children to the village because of lockdown, and sustain them was hard. Alternatively, the man abandoned the wife and the children. On the other instance, the family disintegrated upon eviction by the landowner or the landlord. In all these 3 incidences, we see that the duty of care for children was placed on the mothers. And in other incidences, we see that people were switching the traditional role of gender, including women now were becoming the breadwinners, and men had become docile. They were doing nothing at home. They were not used to staying at home. But what this resulted into is land pressure and environment degradation. As having an enterprise in urban centers presented environmental change to the youth. It also provided opportunities and imperatives for young people to be creative. For the youth were ushered in what they termed into the new normal. Before the outbreak, young people were employed in mainly informal sector as street vendors, bar attendants, bicycle and motorcycle taxi boarders, taxi operators. There were teachers, bar attendants, stage performers in the music, dance and drama, DJs. They were dealing in this cross-border trade. Now, because most of these activities were curtailed, were stopped, youth left the urban areas and went to rural areas. Many joined agriculture, others joined horticulture, poetry, brick making, fishing, sand mining, charcoal burning. Now, it's important to know that those activities that were allowed by government to go on, they had direct impact on the environment. For example, charcoal was allowed to move. So charcoal trucks were allowed to move because people in the urban centers needed charcoal. Vegetables were allowed to move. Brick making, construction industry was allowed to go on. So brick making was on high demand. Fishing, there was a ban on the fish, but still people, because of security, people still would go to the lake to try to fish. But the key part was sand mining. They had banned people from fishing, so people were now in serious sand mining. And then charcoal burning. So these, originally the young people had left these ones for older people to carry on. So now we saw most of the young people were switching specifically to the vegetable, to the agriculture. Now, switching to farming, you should ask yourself, what kind of farming? If you are growing vegetables, you are growing them in the swamp. If you are making bricks, you have to cut trees to burn charcoal, or you have to deal with the clay from the swamp. If you are growing tomatoes or cabbages, all these ones require slashing the swamps. If you are doing sand, it means you have to harvest the sand from the lakes and the rivers. As we were praising young people for being initiative, for being creative, we did not also consider that these were destroying the environment. Now, can I first skip the next slide? Skip that slide. Let's go to the other one first. Next, I had the people ask when we were in the village, that I'll give one story here, that during COVID, a man would see a tree in the compound and the neighborhood, and the first thing he thinks about is money. When young people went in the village, they found the mango trees, the shades the old people were using in the village. For them, they were interpreting money out of it. They looked at the swamps that were left a long time. They were looking at bricks and money. They looked at the sand available. For them, they were looking at money. They were looking at all the trees. They are like, this is a place to cut trees, wood, ship to Kampala, take to urban centers, and earn quick money. So the natural resources were looked at, immediately interpreted as source of survival for young people. Now let's go back to the other slide, which I told you to skip. Can we go back? No, go back. When we are in the community, one of the leaders, the elders we interviewed, asked us a question. What is the alternative? What did you expect people to do? For people here were lake farmers. They were fishermen. Soldiers had prevented people to go into the fish. Near the lake, they cannot grow food because monkeys are there. And they could not walk to the market because it was far. So they had to cut trees to make a charcoal so they can move to go and sell charcoal. They had to clear swamps so they can grow vegetables. They had to destroy fish by mining sand. They had to destroy the wetland by making bricks and sand mining. Forests were destroyed for survival. The question I want to pose to all of you and to the policy thinkers, what was the alternative? This is a question that has disturbed us, even us as the researchers. What is the alternative? And as I make conclusion, while the Ugandan success story of limiting the spread of COVID-19 and trying to adapt the WHO guideline cannot go unrecognized. However, the impact of the drastic measures, especially on the lockdown, increased the vulnerability of the urban youth. And the horrible situation in the urban centers resulted into many young people choosing to switch back to the rural areas to get family support, especially food. And the COVID-19 pandemic stretched the urban youth to the extreme vulnerability to the limit. Invulnerability of urban youth, where health care services were limited. These communities also lacked adequate supply of clean water, shelter, and housing. But this drove the young people away from urban centers and forced them to go to rural areas. As we speak now, many of the rural areas lost the environment, and trees that cannot grow in 30 years were cut down. Swamps were cleared. And the question remains, what is the alternative? Probably, as we plan the COVID-19, we have to think about beyond the medical connotation of COVID-19 and try to look at COVID-19 as an environmental problem. I rest my case. Thank you, Asante. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jerome, for the very elaborate presentation. We have another two. I will not try to summarize what you have said. We have another two presentations. I will just jump to the next one. Yes, Dr. Choge, the floor is yours. Can you hear us?
Thank you so much, Chair of Session. Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Can I be heard?
Yes, we can hear you. Continue, please.
Thank you so much. As you've heard, my name is Dr. Choge Chepkemboi. I'm going to do this presentation, which was done by the two of us. That is myself and Dr. Rob. Dr. Rob is a lecturer at Masai Mara University, and I'm at Koitalel University College. Thank you. Our presentation is premised on, kindly give me the first slide. Yes, education amidst conflict and forced displacement. Whose agenda is it? We looked at education amidst conflict in place of residents of displaced people, that is in Kakuma refugee camp. And we noted that education being a basic right for all learners, irrespective of their ability, status, or conditions, which the learners find themselves, and in this case, those who found themselves in the refugee camp. And the schools that were there were supposed to provide this very, very basic need to the children who have been displaced, which realized that school-going children who have acquired the refugee status have challenges that are varied, wide, and very impactful, like the lack of harmonized curriculum, bearing in mind that these are children who have come from across the borders of Kenya in the neighboring countries with their diverse curriculum and methods of teaching. The other was policy framework on commitment of planning, implementation, and facilitating the management of such education as required for the benefit of the learners by all stakeholders. So it was noted that this needed to be done so that it benefits the diverse community of learners. In 2011, Rogers asserted that nearly everything considered as human could be found in childhood. So when this stage of life, our children are happy, healthy, full of affection, and properly directed, people are left with strength to do everything else that comes along their ways. With the realization that those who have received this refugee status came as a result of armed conflicts, affecting millions of children, affecting their daily lives, being disrupted by acts of atrocity, which actually made and disrupted their future development. This reality affects fundamental rights of children and basically education. All agents of education, as said, are affected in these circumstances. The education team, students, family infrastructure, school environment, curriculum, and strategies delivered by teachers gives them strength to deal with everything as I've already said. So it is estimated that approximately 57 million children of primary school age did not attend school, and this was recorded by UNICEF in 2014, and that more than 13 million of those children are in countries directly or indirectly affected by armed conflicts, and Kenya being part of that, and Kakuma being the refugee camp that these children ran for refuge with their families. International non-governmental organizations began to prioritize education as an essential component of humanitarian response due to the recognition that education can play a critical role in facilitating stability, imparting life-saving messages, establishing, among other reasons. So schools play a very important role in molding the lives of these people. Today, Africa has more displaced people than any other continent in the world. Africa continues to experience expanding and record levels of forced displacement as a result of predatory governments, political fragmentation, violent extremist groups, and the advent of COVID-19 escalated the cause and the impact of conflict in Africa and in Kenya. Ironically, putting together all these communities that have been displaced from their countries led to a number of issues which had formed the basis for which the presumed problems were discussed, researched, and the possible solutions on the same highlighted. The estimated population in Kakuma, Kenya is about, was about 233,648 people in Kakuma camp, and Kalobei, which is in the neighborhood, has an estimate of 45,122, according to UNHCR report of 2020. So basically, it totals about over 500,000 people who have been displaced. This paper examined the education of displaced children attending schools in Kakuma refugee camp and on the face of conflict. Amongst the questions that were said to be answered included who benefits from these conflicts and the sufferings of the refugee children, whose agenda is the constant conflict serving, and who is responsible for education of these children. What are the main barriers that prevent displaced populations from accessing education? And what approaches can be put in place or be used to overcome these barriers? So those questions were asked and some of the possible solutions were developed. The information about education, when you look at the statement of the problem, amidst conflict and forced displacement, was of paramount importance because that could form a major needed basis on how to competently plan for quality education of such learners in conflict zones and refugee camps. It's worth noting that the education of learners who acquired refugee status required special treatment if the education objectives set out were to be achieved. Many of the learners had undergone a lot of psychological torture, among other problems. Kakuma refugee camp was composed of multinational community which provided a home for several children who came from 7 different nationalities, as well as over 20 ethnic communities surrounding Kakuma in Kenya, and as well as the neighboring countries. And these countries include Sudan, Ethiopia, Uganda, Somalia, Rwanda, Burundi, and Congo. So it means from all these countries, people have been put together in a camp with different needs. And therefore, all the refugees from these countries were put in one place to facilitate administrative duties like food distribution, healthcare, security, and education. Yet, education needs are quite diverse and unique to each group based on the country of origin. COVID-19 also presented new challenges that disrupted what was almost known and being used by the refugees in terms of impact and protocols. It was clear that there was a complete lockdown, there was no movement, and therefore children going to school became an issue, despite that the government has said they could be put together, the Kenyan government, so that they could learn as a team. But realizing that that could not work because of the fact that social distance had to be taken into consideration. Therefore, the research design for this study was descriptive survey. Mixed research methods was used to help validate and translate the findings from the questionnaires, from the interviews that were conducted, to get to the problems that people felt on a daily basis and answer the questions that had been developed for this research. And therefore, based on that, the findings on different questions that were asked leading to answering what had been the main objectives of the study was as follows. The first finding was on the steps taken to improve management of learning in Kakuma refugee camp. Questions were asked on what strategies could be put in place so that learning could be well managed and be able to achieve its objective. And approximately 90% of the respondents says that there were operational rules and regulations set out to discipline errant learners, while 77 agreed that in-service program for the teacher training was being started to equip teachers with the necessary skills and knowledge on managing a diverse background. Almost 73% of the respondents said that the government was presenting itself to support through financial and material support, while a good percentage of 64 agreed that the camp was liaising with the government and other bodies to enable them, next slide please, to enable them provide education and manage for the refugee children. The other presentation that was found, or finding, was based on the program manager's response on the use of multidisciplinary teaching. The use of multidisciplinary teaching approach was not practiced. The majority said that it was skewed towards a Kenyan curriculum, which was not serving and being used through the same methods of the countries of origin of the refugees. While 3% of the respondents disagreed, and others disagreed strongly that this was not being adhered to at all. All the respondents that were asked this question confirmed that all learners had access to both exams, termly exams, and also the national exams. Sorry for that write-up. And when they were asked whether all learners had access to learning in the camp, 67% disagreed, while 33% strongly disagreed, meaning that there was no access of education and quality education to the learners in the refugee camp. So the findings showed that, next slide please. The questions on the responses on funding and government support and the nature of the environment. It was realized that all the respondents were in the affirmative, that there was no adequate funding on education for the displaced learners on conflict zones. 33% agreed that the Kenya government partly supported the learning for the refugees. Of course, they were providing the teachers and the school facilities, which were not enough for a population that was growing by the day. Also, a group of these respondents, 33%, disagreed, while the remaining strongly disagreed, saying that the environment was not as conducive for learning as it were in a place that is not within the refugee camp. So learning at the refugee camp was disrupted, inhibited, and the majority of the children were actually affected by the warring communities within the camp. So it's a fact that the communities, all the communities that have been in conflict found themselves confined in one place, and the conflicts actually continued. So the data showed that this category of learners were not being supported both by the environment which they were in and the issues they found themselves in terms of the conflict and warring communities. The learners had an appraisal test, which was looking at their level and their ability of learning. And it shows that the majority of the learners, especially those who were seen in class 7 and 8, performed very poorly in the tests. And this could be attributed to the challenges that the children are going through. A lot of psychological instability, trauma, language barrier, inappropriate placement, and inadequate resources. So as much as they would be having the ability to learn, the psychological instability, the trauma, the language barrier, the English and Swahili language that is dominantly being used in teaching may have actually become an inhibiting factor. All this might also contribute to poor access and quality of education. However, all is not lost. Some students scored good grades, and these were about 18% of them. The rest scored below average. In terms of gender presentation, of course, there was a table in the presentation. Boys are the majority in attendance to school, and they also do better than the girls. And this could have been attributed to gender and stereotypes foisted on women and girls in the refugee camps. Notable is the low enrollment. Although 55% of the refugees in Kakuma are children, over half of the school-age children do not even attend school. Factors impacting school attendance included child labor, cultural barriers, and lack of resources, family needs, and early marriages. So these girls would find themselves disadvantaged as opposed to the boys. However, as much as we would look at these disadvantages, even the boys were not any better, though of course majority would be in school. On the response on whose responsibility education of the displaced children, on responding to the question on the questionnaire, the participants stated the following as the following groups as actively participating in education process: the Kenya government through the Ministry of Education, religious groups, non-governmental organizations, and international communities. So the fact here is that many groups participate to support education of the children in refugee camp in Kakuma. Challenges facing provision of education amid this conflict and forced displacement in Kenya. The challenges take place concurrently, and they really affect within and even away from within the hosting country and the hosting communities and countries of origin. Uncertainty of refugee security and safety arising from the government of Kenya. There was an ultimatum on the closure of the refugee camps. Continued conflicts and fights among the warring communities in the camp. And when there is lack of space, there is lack of peace because of the limited space. So space is another cause. Lack of accountability by service providers because of lack of policy and who does what, when, and how. So it appears that occasionally all the parties involved would be imagining the other party as undertaken that responsibility. Language of instruction was noted also as a major factor among the learners of diverse nationalities and backgrounds. Maintaining communication and information sharing among the many partners involved in the providing education for displaced population became a challenge, because it seems each group would be doing their own part and keeping it to themselves, and the other group wouldn't know. Either there would be a duplication or none at all in terms of services being provided. Inadequate resources, that one came out so many times, that resources ranging from facilities school facilities to even provision of shelter and food and health facilities, among others. Insecurity and psychological instability of the children, the families, and their communities. Remember, we've been told occasionally they'll be fighting amongst themselves. Children would be arriving from the areas of conflict into the camp, and for lack of psychological support, then these children for a very long time would continue suffering and they will not be able to attend school and even concentrate. Curriculum choice for refugees is challenging for a number of reasons. One is that it is being given by the hosting community, yet the refugees, the children in the camp have come from different countries with their own different curriculum choice. It can be highly politicized and emotive for the refugee communities and the host government, provoking sensitivities around identity, culture, and religious backgrounds within the countries of origin and the hosting country. So curriculum decisions related to language of instruction and accessing examination and certification have far-reaching implications for refugee children, including future educational and livelihood opportunities during continued displacement and even after repatriation. Why is this? Is because these children will go back with their families and they need to have that education being relevant for them into their future. The teaching workforce of teachers is also limiting, bearing in mind that this is a very essential provision of quality education. And therefore, when there's forced displacement, the tendency is that teachers, majority of them will not be there. Maybe they've been also displaced or they are not able to work in that environment, and therefore it causes acute shortage affecting education. Using also the hosting countries get from there. That I was saying that the use of teachers in the hosting country and the communities presents another challenge among the learners because of the language of instruction and the number of teachers available. There was also a question on sustainable strategies in the provision and management of education amidst conflict and forced displacement in Kenya. Several strategies were presented during the research, and one of them was on mobilization of resources from communities, charities, and the private sector, in addition to development and humanitarian partners. Since there is acute shortage of resources, acute shortage of teachers, and even other necessities and other facilities that requires to support education, it was realized it's important to continue supporting, continue asking for more resources from those who have already gone there, and of course the government of Kenya. There was also need to coordinate efforts by the partners in the collaboration so as to share key information and make use of existing tools in building a robust education system that is capable of managing crisis and attracting the funding to manage displaced populations, and especially the children who are going to school. Development of a refugee education policy to address some of the legal and policy bottlenecks restricting integration of refugees into national education systems sensitization of relevant agencies on implementation of existing policies, but for better definition of roles and responsibilities of various bodies involved in education in Kenya. Those also need to develop a plan focused on incorporating the education needs of refugees, supplemented by non-governmental organizations to help reduce the overload on the learners. So as they develop a policy, it is important to know that a common framework for aligning partner activities with those of the government in support of education, especially in situations where both development and humanitarian partners are participating, so that the government would be able to know these activities and align them within the law of the country. This need to strengthen government accountability mechanisms in line with frameworks for effective monitoring and evaluation of the education system, and also establish clear audit systems to be able to ensure that what is being given is beneficial to the children in the camp and even when they return at such a time when it comes. They need to put in place management information and communication system to coordinate the frameworks so that each group and those affected in the camp, and especially the schools and the children, would be able to get the correct information that is given through the country and even from the countries of origin. Next slide, please. So in this case, the ministries of education and their partners, including education clusters that exist in the camp and within the country, and both sides of the border, must cooperate and coordinate in terms of the returnees and in terms of the returns that are being realized within the education system. We are saying this because we realized over time there's been need for the refugees to return, and in the case of Somalia, the refugees have started to return, especially from Dadaab refugee camp, across the border to their country. So if the refugees will be going back to their countries of origin, then it means the education system should be one that will help them to settle and benefit from it once in their countries of origin. And even if they have not gone back, it will help them to vent for their livelihoods and be able to settle. So this was stated by education officers. The study concluded that education amidst conflict and forced displacement is an agenda for the several partners led by the host government, that is the Kenya government, and the host communities from around Kakuma camp, and also the international communities that are involved within the camps and the localities around, the non-governmental organizations, among others, that there is need to harmonize these contributions from the many partners through policy framework that will help benefit the children and their education moving into the future. The following recommendations were extracted from the research: that refugees education should be mainstreamed in the national education system. There should be an increase in number of security officers to curb the frequent conflicts arising within the camp and among the warring communities. Mixing together refugees from diverse backgrounds with intention of making them to stay like members of the same family in order to eliminate infighting is necessary. introduction of relevant teacher training to adequately equip the teachers with relevant skills and knowledge to handle the refugee learners, development of policy framework on commitment of planning, implementing, and facilitating the management of education as required for the benefit of the learners should be done by all stakeholders. Thank you so much for listening. That is what was established. Asante sana. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Choge. For the presentation, we are running very much late in our time. The next presentation will be by Dr. Brenda. Then if you can give us some 30 minutes or 20 minutes for question and answer, we'll appreciate it. So I'll ask Dr. Brenda to be the next presenter. Dr. Brenda, over to you, please. Can you hear us?
Thank you so much. Yes,
Thank you. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. Thank you so much for the opportunity. My topic is irregular cash transfers and the impact of COVID-19 experiences among South Sudanese urban refugees in Kampala, Uganda. So the layout of my presentation will be, first of all, I will start by explaining who is an urban refugee. Next slide, please. Okay, I'll just proceed. Or a person. Next slide. Yes. An urban refugee refers to a refugee who resides in an urban area instead of in a refugee settlement or camp. In Uganda, the Refugee Act, the 2006 Refugee Act was amended in 2010, allowing refugees to the freedom of mobility and also to choose where to reside, either in a settlement or in an urban area. So Uganda has been hosting or registering urban refugees since 2010. Among these include South Sudanese, Congolese, Somalis, Eritreans, but the topic today, or my focus of the study, is on South Sudanese urban refugees. Of course, urban refugees come to the city because, refugees move to urban areas because of the expectations that the urban life promises. Better livelihood opportunities, better education facilities, better medical care, and also better living conditions. However, often what the reality is different from their expectations. What they go through while in the urban areas is not what they anticipated. They find themselves struggling together with the urban poor, competing for the same resources, same better living conditions, same employment opportunities and education. And their status being urban refugees already between them and the urban poor are more vulnerable because they are refugees. Now, in Uganda, humanitarian assistance that is offered to refugees is mostly directed to settlement-based refugees, while urban refugees are left to fend for themselves. They end up depending on the social networks they construct and also their capabilities to survive. In most cases, or what is actually happening, what happens is that urban refugees form within themselves networks to access employment, to access jobs in order to maintain their life in the urban area. The urban area is characterized by the use of money on a daily basis, and the COVID-19 increased the already existing challenges faced by urban refugees and also introduced new challenges that they had never faced before. So urban refugees tend to find themselves in an urban area that necessitates them to have money to survive, money for rent, money for food, money for medication, money to access education, money for living conditions, which the urban area, which has to facilitate cash transfer aid or humanitarian render aid to all vulnerable groups, because one, they are believed to promote dignity at least, and they give the beneficiary the discretion to use this money as they to decide and create agency among the beneficiaries. Cash transfers can either be conditional or unconditional. Conditional cash transfers come with a target, or they come with a condition on how to use this money. For example, money for education, money for medication. Well, it's regular and unconditional cash transfers are highly encouraged because they promote self-reliance among these refugees. Next slide, please. But then, how did COVID-19 impact on the urban refugees, the South Sudan urban refugees in Kampala? Now, we all know that COVID-19 has had a ripple effect. The pandemic has been globally felt. The cash used, or the networks of these urban refugees, especially in Kampala, or even I've had studies that the urban refugees depend on remittances sent to them from relatives abroad, family in the diaspora, and also were cut down and affected by COVID. Those who had small businesses ended up losing their businesses because the government closed, in Uganda, the government closed some businesses, for example, saloons, where some female refugees are employed. Bars were closed, restaurants were closed, transport costs were high. These were some of the SOPs, the standard operation procedures put in place to prevent the spread of COVID-19. So all these impacted on the urban refugees, that some lost jobs, others lost the networks that used to send to them money, and all the remittances were reduced. So the urban refugees remained stuck in Kampala with no means to sustain themselves. And also, the COVID-19 pandemic actually negatively affected, in the case of South Sudan refugees, they, just like any other urban refugee, they have a community for urban refugees. It's called the Uganda South Sudan Urban Refugee Community. This community it is a community-based organization, refugee-based. It helps and supports South Sudanese urban refugees in Kampala. It helps them it acts as a liaison office between humanitarian organizations to assist them with legal bills, to assist them with also medical bills. But during the pandemic,
Hello, Brenda.
Uganda refugee, hopeful enough, felt like their community was unable or incapable of sustaining them and helping them. So COVID-19 led to this refugee-based organization to lose popularity among the members that it states to look after care of. It could not afford to take care of them anymore. So what were the experiences of South Sudanese? Yes? Yes?
Continue.
Hello?
Please continue.
Hello? Hello? Do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Please continue.
Hello?
There is a lag.
Brenda, we hear you. Go ahead.
Go ahead, please.
Do you hear me, please?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay,
Please.
thank you so much. So what were the experiences of the... Thank you. So what were the experiences of the South Sudan? Thank you. Now, when the experience of South Sudan urban refugees, I have a quote. The participant was actually saying we had no food and didn't know what to do. I didn't know who to ask because also my neighbor also had no food. So the situation with what was happening in the urban area during COVID-19, there was a food shortage. People lack food. Both Ugandans and citizens were cut those relatives who are in the settlements to send them basics like salt, food, not to sustain them. So the change dynamics whereby people in the settlement look at urban life as the best or look at urban life as a step ahead, you know, to a higher level. They are making urban refugees and settlement-based refugees. Settlement-based refugees had assistance, had money, had access to humanitarian assistance throughout COVID. They had protection from NGOs, they had protection from civil society, they had protection from the Ugandan government. But then urban refugees never had that kind of protection that the refugees within the settlements had. That's why I called it, I had a term, the mismatch, whereby assistance which was meant to be diverted, which could have ideally been diverted to urban refugees, because during COVID, a shortage of food was the peak areas, while rural areas where the settlements are best had food. They had food because rural areas, that's where Ugandan food is grown. So actually, even humanitarian organizations were diverting attention to settlement-based refugees, living urban refugees. So I look at that as a total mismatch, because rural areas, I mean settlement-based refugees, had direct cash transfers given to them. They had assistance, they had monies. Refugees in Chiriandongo settlement were given money to recover from the COVID pandemic. An NGO sent USD, $1,000 one-off cash transfer to 10,000 refugee households in Chiriandongo to recover from the COVID impact, or to recover from the COVID shock. So, but our refugees did not receive that kind of financial assistance. Those that received it received irregular cash transfers. So what do I call, or what do I mean when I say irregular cash transfers? Irregular cash transfers are void of a routine or schedule, making it difficult for the beneficiaries to plan for the money they use. So they don't know how much money they are receiving, they don't know when they are receiving it, and they don't know how many times they will receive it. Did urban refugees receive cash during COVID-19? Yes, they received cash which was irregular. If you look at the first quotation here from a participant. The participant states that I received a message from UNHCR giving me 80,000. The message is all the money is supposed to be withdrawn from an Airtel agent. Then this money came in, and then the next money came in October. The first one came in July, and the next money came in October. The next money, the first in July was 80,000 Uganda shillings. The next one was 22,000 Uganda shillings. Then when you go to the next page or slide, you realize that there's another one, and another participant who actually received more money than this one. This participant received 130 Uganda shillings and received it twice, because they think they received it twice because they registered on two numbers, different numbers. And another participant also quoted, said, I did not receive any money during COVID-19. I do not know why, yet I'm also a refugee. So it becomes tricky to explain why some get and others don't get. Because in Kampala, what I never stated at the beginning, the urban refugees are clustered together. So you find that South Sudanese are living together, Congolese are living together in the same locality, and Somalis are living in the same locality. This is common to refugees. This is common among refugees or displaced people. They tend to cling to their fellow ethnicities or persons they share with cultural orientations for a sense of belonging, one, and also for security purposes. So the three quotations are illustrating the irregularity of the cash received by these South Sudan urban refugees. Clearly, the amount of money received varies, and also the frequency varies, and also some did not receive the money. So, because they didn't know the source, where is this money coming from? Is it from UNHCR? Is it from which organization? Is it the government of Uganda? They didn't know who is giving out this money. When you read the paper or the article, you realize that some refugees, urban refugees, were frauded or exploited by corrupt officials at the office of the Prime Minister, where they registered to get their refugee status. Some were asked to pay money in order for their names to be registered, and they keep receiving money from UNHCR, which they don't know whether it is this money they got that it was because they registered their names with UNHCR, or the lack of information or above. So in conclusion, COVID-19 disrupted the streams of income for urban refugees which they depended on, therefore increasing their vulnerability. COVID-19 magnified the already existing challenges of urban refugees, or it increased, or it worsened the already challenging situation that urban refugees face. And although cash transfers proved to be ideal within the COVID pandemic because of their potential to limit the spread of the virus and also to reach beneficiaries, many beneficiaries in a short period of time, they were irregular for urban refugees, and they caused anxiety, they caused uncertainty, and they left some, actually, for example, those in the community-based refugee office, they left them discontented with the personnel or the officers, their fellow refugees who man this office. And I conclude or give recommendations. I stated 3 recommendations. One is that large sum regular cash transfers are highly recommended for urban refugees because the urban life is necessitated by cash. The urban life is greatly dependent on the availability of cash. Therefore, regular cash transfers are needed within the urban refugee setting. Then the government of Uganda should also include refugees, urban refugees, within its settings or within its programs for its citizens, because during COVID-19, the government of Uganda actually gave money to vulnerable, a social cash transfer to vulnerable citizens, urban dwellers, but left out. They considered citizens who were vulnerable based on occupation. The low-income earners were given a social cash transfer fund, but this excluded urban refugees, yet they are part of the urban city and they are vulnerable. They need assistance. And also civil society organizations and NGOs working with urban refugees should consider supporting community-based, refugee community-based organizations, because these are initiatives from the community, refugee community, to help fellow refugees. But shortage of funding or lack of funding is their number one greatest setback. They cannot help refugees or urban refugees if they do not have money. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Brenda, for the presentation. We have about 30 minutes now to conclude our webinar. Sorry for the delay. We started late, that's why we delayed also. So the presenters have, I would like to thank all the presenters. They have touched, they have looked at the problems, the impact of COVID-19 from various perspectives on various communities like borderland communities, urban refugee communities, and their coping mechanisms, urban-rural migration and its impact on the environment and so on, education among refugee communities and settings and conflict situations. And finally, we had a presentation by Brenda on urban refugees and its impact due to irregular cash transfers. And I thank you very much, all the presenters. I have also some scholars, migration scholars here with me from University of Dar es Salaam and University of Maseno. So the floor is open for questions. Even the presenters, you can ask questions also, not only respond to questions. So I open the floor now for questions and answers. Any comment, questions, answers? Dr. Oiso from University of Maseno, I have a question.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the presentations. I really enjoyed listening. Dr. Jerome, from sociological perspective, when there is rural-urban migration, then crime also increases in the urban area. Of course, you are talking about urban-rural migration, which is the reverse. And you say that young people especially moved back to the villages. Of course, they didn't have work. Did you come across any stories around increase in crime or something like that? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Oiso. Dr. Jerome, you can respond.
Thank you.
Then we'll go to Saguto after Jerome's response. Okay.
Thank you very much. Yes, we found the crime, but in the urban center, crime was not at that rate the way it was expected, because there was tight security within the urban centers. There was a lot of police parading and the army. But still, because people lacked food and people were using illicit drugs to kill the boredom, the anxiety, yes, there were crime. There was an increased domestic violence in the urban centers. But worse even still, when the urban youth went to the village, the crime rate intensified. They impregnated, defiled many of the young students, the children who were not in school. There was theft, a lot of stealing in the villages. They stole food, they stole property. And the worst part was the channels through which those who are affected would report were curtailed. Somebody could not walk to the police because of the curfew, and the movements were hard. The courts of law were almost not operational. So even where people want to go for counseling or to reach people, because of the restricted movement, it was hard even to have people report the cases that are going through. Yes, there was increased crime in the city and worsened crime in the communities and the villages. And worst of it all, the young people who went in the village, once the lockdown was lifted, they came back to Kampala. So we have many children now in the villages who lack the fathers and the parents because their fathers probably ran away and people's kids were cut to make charcoal. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jerome. I have seen a hand, Sagutu. Please proceed. Saguto.
Sorry, Alemu, I didn't do this paper alone, so some questions can be directed to my co-author, Dr. Trofena. I think she can also answer some of those questions.
She is listening. Yeah. So any other question? There is a question on the chat. I want ask questions. Edward, please go ahead.
Okay.
What's your question?
Hello?
Yes, please.
Hello?
We can hear you. Yes, we can hear you. Continue.
Yes. My concern goes to the last presenter. I think that's Brenda.
Mm-hmm.
It's about vulnerability of urban refugees. Brenda, thank you for the presentation, but lumping up refugees as a vulnerable group, I think then we fall prey to that dominant narrative that refugees are all vulnerable. In your findings, were all the same? Were they all? Sorry for the feedback. What's their sense of urgency? Did you find any? Thank you.
Thank you, Edward. Brenda, you can respond. Brenda, your network is not good. Can you move a little bit? We are not hearing you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Now?
Yeah.
Hello?
Yes. Please continue.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay, thank you. Refugees have, they of course, they are not all vulnerable, or the refugee community, to sum them up as all vulnerable. There are different clusters of refugees, different classes or levels, statuses, or what can I call it? There are those who are wealthier than others. But during COVID-19, the pandemic rendered refugees, those urban refugees, South Sudan urban refugees, vulnerable to an extent. All of them were not equally vulnerable, but they were on chances or money from Aberdeen. This flow was cut or reduced, therefore leading them to be somehow vulnerable as they used to get within that sustained them and put them at a higher level, or more self-sufficient, more than the rest or the others. reduced. So they became also vulnerable to an extent during this COVID-19 pandemic. But yes, refugees are not all equal, that the level of vulnerability is equal, but COVID-19 induced a level of vulnerability among them. Thank you.
Thank you, Brenda. I can see two hands, Dr. Choge, and there is Area, there is Dr. Alfred. So Dr. Choge first, please.
Okay. Okay, thank you so much, Alemu. This is
Alfred?
Dr. Rob. We are sharing a screen with Dr. Chang.
Oh, okay.
Yes, and I'm Dr. Rob.
Okay.
Good afternoon, colleagues, and
Good afternoon.
thank you, the panelists, for this very insightful presentation. We've really learned a lot. I think my quick question, host, is again to Dr. Jerome Ndeke on his presentation on the COVID-19 induced urban rural migration and environmental degradation in Uganda. I know, yes, just say that, of course, when I directed the question, I may also direct him with his co-presenter. Of course, looking at that period, that's almost around 1 year, that's the post-COVID period, and the kind of hills in quotes that the youth presented again at the rural area has been well articulated by Dr. Jerome. I wanted to ask you that, of course, you talked of the curfew in the village. Of course, there were those regulations that were put in place to ensure that the COVID-19 is contained. And from his presentation, we got to know that these youth who had moved to the village were busy with all those social ills when the government was in place to ensure that the curfew was on place, most probably to ensure that the issue of the COVID spread was reduced. I don't know. It really sounds like a cinema. It sounds that these youth from the urban centers were busy doing all those social ills when the government was just maybe watching, maybe at a distance. I don't know. Was that really true? And again, is it that probably these youth from the urban centers almost immediately moved to the rural centers again? Maybe that was not the practice earlier, because from what we are seeing, that these were the youth that have been in the urban centers all that time, and it was only during the time of COVID-19 that again en masse they went to the village to again cause all these social ills. Was that really the case, as it were, or probably because it sounds that there was that alarming rate as a result of that mass transfer?
I think they've got a question. They've got a question. Let's give them an opportunity to respond.
Yes.
Thank you. I like the question. Just to put a little bit of meat to the background of Ugandan situation, we had a lockdown to almost 2 years in Uganda. And the president and the government was very intentional to make sure people don't move from one place to another, to curtail people from the city to go back in the village that would cause the spread of the disease. But just for you to know, in one case, there was a time when they had opened the schools and in the second lockdown, and then they closed the schools. And all the young people in Kampala, in the buses, they had to go back to the villages. And when they went back to the villages, that's how many people in the villages also were experiencing this issue. So the movements were restricted, but people would walk for days to reach their villages. We are talking of 2 years experience. Number two, it is not that the youth in the town were socially evil and were ill as such. No, they were actually creative. We commend their initiatives to start growing vegetables, to work, to come up with another creative ways of doing it. The only challenge was, in the city, there are much strict restrictions of movements. You are curtailed on your veranda. You're not even allowed to go in the compound somewhere or near the street, and you barely don't have a garden. In the village, people are allowed to be in the garden, to grow food, to look after their animals. In the city, you stay in the room, in the house. So people looked for every opportunity to escape, and many people escaped to the villages. And like I said, we did not intentionally look for this question about the urban rural migration. It was until we're in Kampala and in urban centers, they would tell us our people left, our people left. Then when we went to the villages, we asked, where did you come from? We found a number of people who left Kampala and went to the villages. So they were not necessarily social evils. They could have improved a lot of things, but on the side of the environment, they increased the land pressure. They also increased environmental degradation, because a guy from the city would look at a mango tree as a source of charcoal and a source of money. He never considered what will happen after the mango tree is cut. What will people eat? No, he's focused on how do I survive and how do I go back to Kampala? Because if you have charcoal, you can take charcoal to Kampala to sell. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. John. Dr. Fenn, if you have anything to add?
Yes. Hey, Trifena. Hello?
Thank you very much for those questions you are asking. Our main focus was to explain the unintended effects of the lockdown on the urban youth. The issue of land degradation, they started cultivating, they started mining, sand mining, and also making bricks from the water, the swamps. They were making bricks from the swamps, clearing the land, and this has had a devastating effect on families. In some homes, all the trees have been cut down. There's no single tree anyway. So we would say more. You see, right now we can just see that they have cut the trees and they are making bricks. They are burning the trees and making charcoal. But then soon that was climate change. It will trigger climate variability. The question they kept on asking is, what is the alternative? Give us the alternative. We have no other way. So I also wanted to ask Dr. Choge and Dr. Rob. Their title, they were talking about whose agenda. And then throughout the presentation, we did not hear or see the link between the question of whose agenda is it that the children, displaced children, are going through the various challenges, whose agenda it is. It didn't come out throughout the paper, or 90% of the paper explains the challenges that these children are facing. But then the question of whose agenda does not come out clearly, so we don't know whether you should keep it or you should remove it from there.
Thank you, Dr. Fena. Dr. Choge, you can respond to that question. Then I'll give the floor to Area. First, Dr. Choge, please.
Thank you, Dr. Alimu. Thank you so much. And thank you, Dr. Trufena, for that quick reminder of whose agenda is it in terms of two things. Whose agenda is the education of the children in these refugee camps, and whose agenda is it in terms of the fights and the sufferings that these children would go through. Actually, I wish to appreciate that so much, because it came out in a very, a little bit of it, but the clear thing is that the agenda of the education of these children in this refugee camps is actually an activity of very many groups that are involved in supporting the education for the children, both within the schools and in the areas, in the communities where they are being hosted. However, in our interviews, it actually came out, and we would want to improve on it, that actually the sufferings that these children, the fights, the conflicts that these people go through is an agenda of those who have interests beyond the presentation of the refugees, the political interests, the dynamics that comes with the wars caused by the warlords, the wars that are caused by lack of resources, that the need for people to satisfy their own needs overwhelms the common good of the people, and that is why they go into conflict, and this conflict takes them into being displaced and being placed in refugee camps. So it came out in our discussions, in the presentations, that there are those who are interested in keeping their interests, their resources away from these people.
Okay, thank you. In the interest of time, can we go to area?
Yes, thank you, Alemo.
Yes,
are you
please.
hearing me? Are you hearing me?
Yes, we can hear you. Yes, please continue.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. My comment and question goes to the first presenter, that is Alfred. Already you're talking about pastoralists at the border. I'm a scholar of pastoralists, and I think that's why I'm interested. And when you look at the behavior of pastoralists in the border areas, usually they form alliances or compete with other pastoral groups or even farmer groups in the border. Now, when you talk about Batuku at the DRC border, you only talk about them crossing and then meeting security problems on the other side of the border, and then the restrictions during the COVID era. But you do not get to tell us, do they form alliances? Are there groups that they are competing with? You know, and probably why you do that is because it gets to my question. You do not mention any voices. I listened to you throughout, but I didn't listen to any voice from the field. Are there voices of the Batuku that you can share with us? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Area.
Thank you,
Dr.
Dr.
Fred,
Ria.
can you respond? Yes, please.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you very much for your comment, Dr. Ria. But I agree with you that the pastors form alliances, and what I called the cultural context of the Batuku at the border is a composition of alliances they make with both other pastors across in the DRC, and the alliances also they form with non-pastors in DRC and Uganda, especially the Bakonjo, the Bamba, the Nandi, who are non-pastors, but they form alliances. And it is from that I said that this cultural context which they formed a long time ago, before even the border came, assisted them to live in this area that is somehow hostile to their livelihood or to their living. The voices, yes, I have the voices, and this was just, it was a paper, and I was presenting in 10 minutes, so I couldn't bring out the whole talk, the whole voice of the respondents, but it is there. Thank you, Dr. Lee.
Okay, thank you.
But
Dr.
I also wanted to ask Dr. Jerome.
Okay, please go ahead.
Yes, he did his research was about three research areas. I mean, areas where he did his research: Gulu, Masaka, and Kampala. So
Yes.
my question is there any significant difference between or similarity as far as the environmental degradation is concerned,
Yes.
due to COVID?
Okay.
And how did COVID affect the youth in these three areas? Is it a general effect, or they have different effects that he could have
Thank you.
in his study? Thank you.
Thank you. Either Dr. Tfena or Dr. Jerome can respond to this one.
Thank you.
Dr.
Thank
Jerome?
you. You hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. Continue, please.
There are considerable differences in these areas, and our choice to these three areas was based on that. In Kampala, we are dealing with both the youth in the upper city and also the lower city, especially those who live in the slums. So we had the areas like Katwe and the areas like in the slum areas like Kawempe and deep down, and also some areas like Nakawa, a little bit urban uplift. Now in Masaka, Greater Masaka, we wanted people on the lake, like people in Nabugabo. We also wanted pastoralists in Sembabule, and also wanted the farmers in Rengo, and then people within the town centers of Masaka city. So it was Greater Masaka. And then for Gulu, we are targeting the Greater Gulu. So we had those in the Gulu city. Then we had those in the rural urban Gulu. And then those, especially those who quickly interface with the people from Southern Sudan. And the environment greatly was impacted differently. Those who live next to the lake, for example, the lake, they were not supposed to fish, but we also know fishermen don't grow food. And the reason they give that monkeys eat their food, they can't grow food, and they can't go in the lake because the soldiers were going to beat them. And they had to walk to the city because of curfew. So their experience is basically the only thing they can do is to cut some trees around the lake and try to maneuver selling those ones, or find ways of illegally mine sand. Now, the people in northern Uganda, in Gulu where we went, those in the urban centers, for them quickly walk to the villages. But some of these areas they had left, they had abandoned the land of their fathers or their ancestors some years ago. Now, already there was land conflicts about who owns which part of the swamp. And people were fighting over that. And then there are cultural leaders who have said, don't cut down the trees. But the same question was coming up, what should we do? We have to get the sand to survive. And yet the people in Sembabule who had the cows, yes, they had the cows, they produced the milk, they had nowhere to sell because the markets were not accessible. And then the people in Rengo, for them, the swamps were cleared. The administrative officer would say, people came, too many, and all the swamps, all the things we had put to control the environment have been eaten up, and people have nowhere to live and what to live on. So there were considerable differences among these areas, and it's good you have asked. Thank you. But Dr. Trofena can add.
Thank you, Dr. Joram. I think Dr. Trofena has nothing to respond to. You have already responded to that, but I see three people now. Dr. Alfred, you have already asked this question, I think. Edward, that's the final question. Edward, I'll give you the floor. You have a question, Edward? Okay. So, Edward, I think he has left or he has no questions. Thank you. So I thank you very much, all the panelists and the participants, for a livelier discussion. I now give the floor for Dr. Trofena to close the session. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Our esteemed participants, thank you very much for your time, commitment, and scholarly contribution to this webinar. As we had agreed earlier on, we are going to publish these papers in the Austria Research Series. We are going to publish this in the Austria Research Series, and therefore the comments that you were given and the ones that you're being asked right now, you may continue reviewing these papers so that when we get them, they may be in better shape and format for us to just do the language editor and then we publish. I also want to assure you that once you finalize your paper and send it to us, as agreed earlier on, we shall send you, the authors, your honorarium as agreed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, panelists and participants. That's all. As Dr. Trofena said, we'll share all the presentations and video, as well as the book that will come out of the research papers on our website. And I thank you. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Okay.